In the summer of 1864, a French priest named Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg sat hunched over a crumbling manuscript in the archives of the Royal Academy of History in Madrid, his fingers tracing symbols that no European had understood for more than 3 centuries. The document before him was one of only 4 Mayan codices known to have survived the systematic destruction ordered by Spanish conquistadors and zealous missionaries in the 16th century, and Brasseur believed that within its painted figures and calendrical glyphs lay evidence of something extraordinary. He had spent years learning the Mayan languages spoken in Guatemala and the Yucatan, years more travelling through the dense jungles where ruined pyramids rose from the forest floor, and now he believed he was on the verge of a discovery that would rewrite the history of human civilization. The symbols on the pages before him seemed to describe a catastrophic event, a great destruction that had engulfed an ancient land and sunk it beneath the waters of the ocean, leaving behind only scattered survivors who had carried their knowledge to the shores of the Americas. Brasseur would eventually announce that he had discovered proof of a lost continent, a vast Pacific realm that had served as the original homeland of all human culture before geological cataclysm erased it from the face of the earth. He called this vanished land Mu, taking the name from what he believed were phonetic elements within the Mayan script, and in doing so he launched a hypothesis that would captivate generations of believers, inspire countless expeditions and publications, and establish one of the most persistent alternative history theories in modern culture. The story of Mu extends across more than 150 years of speculation, controversy, archaeological fraud, and genuine scientific debate about the origins of Pacific Island cultures and the geological history of the Earth's largest ocean. The theory has attracted support from decorated military officers and respected amateur archaeologists, has been invoked to explain everything from the construction of Easter Island's famous statues to the mysterious origins of the Hawaiian Islands' first inhabitants, and has generated a body of literature that continues to grow even as mainstream science has repeatedly and conclusively rejected its central claims. The believers in Mu have ranged from sincere researchers who genuinely thought they were pursuing legitimate historical questions to outright charlatans who fabricated evidence and invented sources to support their profitable publications, and the line between these categories has not always been easy to draw. The scientific response to Mu has involved some of the 20th century's most important advances in geology, oceanography, and archaeological methodology, as researchers develop the tools and techniques necessary to demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that no such continent could have existed within the Pacific during the span of human history. But despite this scientific consensus, the idea of Mu has proven remarkably resilient, adapting to new contexts and incorporating new supposed evidence with each passing decade, transforming from a 19th century scholarly hypothesis into a fixture of contemporary alternative history and New Age spirituality. The origins of the Mu theory cannot be separated from the broader intellectual context of 19th century European colonialism and the intense scholarly interest in ancient civilizations that accompanied the expansion of Western power across the globe. The decades following 1850 witnessed an unprecedented explosion of archaeological discovery, as researchers unearthed the ruins of Troy, deciphered Egyptian hieroglyphics, excavated Mesopotamian ziggurats, and began systematic documentation of the great temple complexes of Southeast Asia and Central America. Each discovery raised new questions about the relationships between ancient cultures, the pathways of human migration, and the possibility that sophisticated civilizations had existed in regions previously dismissed as primitive backwaters. The problem of explaining apparent similarities between geographically distant cultures became a central preoccupation of 19th century scholars, and the hypothesis of lost continental homelands from which all civilizations had originally dispersed represented one influential approach to this puzzle. Atlantis, the sunken island described by Plato in dialogues written around 360 BC, had already captured the European imagination as a potential solution to these mysteries, and the success of Atlantean speculation created an intellectual environment receptive to similar theories about other oceanic realms. Charles-Étienne Brasseur de Bourbourg arrived at his Mu hypothesis through a career that combined genuine linguistic accomplishment with increasingly speculative interpretation. Born in 1814 in the town of Bourbourg in northern France, he had trained for the Catholic priesthood and been ordained in 1845, but his intellectual passions lay less in theology and in the languages and histories of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. He travelled extensively through Mexico and Central America during the 1850s, living among Maya-speaking communities in Guatemala and the Yucatan, and developed a working knowledge of several Mayan languages that few other Europeans of his era could match. His early publications on Mesoamerican culture received favourable notice from established scholars, and his 1857 work on the history of the civilized nations of Mexico and Central America earned him a corresponding membership in the French Academy. The Royal Library in Madrid appointed him to catalogue its collection of materials relating to the Americas, a position that gave him access to documents that had remained largely unstudied since their acquisition centuries earlier. It was in this role that Brasseur encountered the Toronto Codex, a fragmentary Mayan manuscript that would become the foundation for his Mu theory. The Toronto Codex, now recognised as part of a larger document called the Madrid Codex, consists of approximately 70 pages of bark paper covered with painted figures and glyphic inscriptions relating to Mayan religious ceremonies, astronomical calculations, and divinatory practices. Like all surviving Mayan codices, it presents enormous interpretive challenges as the Mayan writing system combined logographic and syllabic elements in ways that scholars are still working to fully understand. Brasseur believed he had found a key to deciphering this system in a manuscript by the 16th century Spanish bishop Diego de Landa, whose Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán included what Landa claimed was a Mayan alphabet. Modern scholars have demonstrated that Landa fundamentally misunderstood how Mayan writing functioned, as he recorded syllabic values when he thought he was recording alphabetic letters, but Brasseur had no way to recognise this error. Applying Landa's supposed alphabet to the Toronto Codex, Brasseur produced translations that bore little relationship to the document's actual content, but that seemed to him to describe a volcanic catastrophe that had destroyed a great land called Mu, sinking it beneath the ocean and scattering its inhabitants across the Pacific. The specific passages that Brasseur interpreted as describing the destruction of Mu involved two glyphs that he read as representing the syllables M and U, which he combined to produce the name of the lost continent. Modern Mayanists have shown that these glyphs actually represented entirely different concepts within the Mayan writing system and had no connection to any geographical entity, but Brasseur's interpretation seemed compelling in the context of contemporary scholarship on ancient catastrophism. The idea that geological cataclysms had repeatedly transformed the Earth's surface and destroyed earlier civilizations enjoyed considerable support among 19th century thinkers, influenced by the catastrophist geology of Georges Cuvier, and by the general sense that the ruins found throughout the world represented the remnants of societies destroyed by natural disasters. Brasseur's Mu hypothesis fit neatly within this intellectual framework, offering an explanation for both the origins of Mesoamerican civilization and the apparent cultural sophistication of Pacific Island peoples that European colonizers had encountered with considerable surprise. Brasseur published his Mu translations in 1869 and 1870, presenting them as scholarly contributions to the understanding of Mayan history, while acknowledging that some aspects of his interpretation remained speculative. The reception among established scholars was mixed, with some praising his linguistic work while questioning his more ambitious conclusions, and others dismissing his translations as fundamentally unreliable. The theory might have faded into obscurity as scholarly skepticism mounted, but Brasseur's work attracted the attention of other researchers who found in Mu a key to puzzles they had been independently investigating. The most influential of these followers was Augustus Le Plongeon, a French-American adventurer whose archaeological work in the Yucatan would expand the Mu hypothesis into a comprehensive theory of ancient history, while simultaneously discrediting it through increasingly fantastic claims and fabricated evidence. Augustus Le Plongeon arrived in the Yucatan in 1873 with his young wife Alice Dixon Le Plongeon, a British-born woman who would become his collaborator, photographer, and co-author throughout their decades of archaeological work in Mexico. Le Plongeon had lived a remarkably varied life before turning to archaeology, having worked as a surveyor in California during the gold rush, practiced medicine in Peru, and developed photographic techniques that earned him international recognition. He approached Mayan archaeology with the technical skills of a trained surveyor and the interpretive boldness of a self-taught enthusiast, producing detailed maps and photographs of Mayan sites that still retain value for modern researchers, while simultaneously constructing elaborate historical narratives that bore little relationship to archaeological evidence. Le Plongeon had encountered Brasseur's work on Mu before arriving in the Yucatan, and he came to Central America convinced that the Mayan ruins concealed evidence of the lost Pacific continent that would vindicate Brasseur's controversial translations. The Le Plongeon spent 12 years conducting archaeological investigations at sites including Chichen Itza, Uxmal, and Ake, documenting inscriptions and architectural features with a thoroughness that impressed contemporary observers while interpreting their findings through an increasingly elaborate theoretical framework. Augustus Le Plongeon claimed to have learned to read Mayan inscriptions fluently, a claim that modern scholars recognize as impossible given the state of Mayan decipherment in the 1870s, and he published translations that told detailed stories about Mayan kings and queens, dynastic conflicts, and catastrophic events. Central to Le Plongeon's interpretations was the figure he called Queen Mu, a Mayan ruler whom he believed had fled the destruction of her homeland and travelled to Egypt, where she had established herself as the goddess Isis and founded Egyptian civilization. This theory connected the Mayan ruins of the Yucatan to the great civilizations of the Old World, while simultaneously linking both to the lost continent of Mu, creating a comprehensive alternative history that placed Mu at the centre of all human cultural development. Le Plongeon's most dramatic archaeological claim involved a sculptural figure he discovered at Chichen Itza in 1875, which he called the Shak Mul. The statue depicted a reclining human figure with bent knees and a vessel or platform resting on its abdomen, a sculptural type that would later be recognized as common throughout Mesoamerica and associated with sacrificial ritual. Le Plongeon, however, identified the figure as a portrait of a specific Mayan prince, whom he had named Chak Mul, based on his interpretations of local inscriptions, claiming that the prince had been a key figure in the events leading to the destruction of Mu and the dispersal of its inhabitants. The discovery attracted international attention and established Le Plongeon's reputation as a significant, if controversial, figure in Mesoamerican archaeology. The Mexican government seized the Chacmul statue for its national museum, leading to a bitter dispute between Le Plongeon and Mexican authorities that would colour his relationship with established archaeological institutions for the remainder of his career. The Le Plongeon returned to the United States in 1885, and Augustus spent the next 2 decades publishing and lecturing on his theories, while growing increasingly bitter about his rejection by mainstream scholars. His 1896 book Queen Mu and the Egyptian Sphinx presented his Mu theory in its fullest form, arguing that the lost continent had been located in the Pacific Ocean and had served as the original homeland of a civilized race, whose survivors had colonized both the Americas and the Mediterranean world after Mu's destruction. The book received scathing reviews from professional archaeologists, who pointed out that Le Plongeon's linguistic claims were unsupportable and that his historical narratives were pure invention. The scholarly consensus by this point had firmly rejected both Brasseur's original Mu translations and Le Plongeon's elaborate expansions of the theory, and it seemed likely that the hypothesis would fade from serious consideration as more rigorous approaches to Mesoamerican archaeology took hold. But the Mu theory was about to receive its most influential advocate, a retired British military officer whose 1926 publication would transform an obscure scholarly controversy into a phenomenon of popular culture. James Churchward claimed to have learned about Mu not from Brasseur's problematic translations or Le Plongeon's archaeological fantasies, but from a set of ancient tablets that a Hindu priest in India had shown him during his service in the British military during the 1870s. According to Churchward's account, he had been stationed in India when he befriended a temple priest who possessed tablets written in an ancient language that the priest called Naikal, which he claimed was the original language of humanity. The priest allegedly taught Churchward to read this language over a period of years, and the tablets described in detail the history of Mu, its location in the Pacific, its civilization, its religion, and its ultimate destruction. Churchward spent decades researching the Mu question, he claimed, visiting archaeological sites around the world and gathering evidence that confirmed what the tablets had revealed. When he finally published his findings in The Lost Continent of Mu in 1926, the book presented a detailed account of a vast Pacific civilization that had flourished tens of thousands of years before recorded history, and had been destroyed by volcanic eruptions and earthquakes that sank it beneath the ocean. Churchward's Mu differed in significant ways from the versions proposed by Brasseur and Le Plongeon. He located the continent more specifically in the Central Pacific, describing it as stretching from Hawaii to Fiji and from Easter Island to the Marianas, an area of roughly 10,000 miles east to west and 5,000 miles north to south. He claimed that Mu had been home to 64 million inhabitants at its peak, living in a sophisticated civilization that had developed writing, architecture, navigation, and religious philosophy far in advance of any subsequent society. The Muans, as Churchward called them, had colonized the rest of the world during the height of their civilization, establishing daughter colonies in North and South America, in Asia, and in an Atlantic realm that Churchward identified with Plato's Atlantis. When geological catastrophe destroyed Mu approximately 12,000 years ago, according to Churchward's chronology, the survivors and the colonists were left to preserve what fragments of Muan wisdom they could, giving rise to the diverse civilizations that European explorers would later encounter across the Pacific and beyond. The evidence Churchward cited for these claims included not only the Narcal tablets, which no other scholar ever saw or verified, but also interpretations of archaeological remains from around the Pacific Rim. He argued that the great stone statues of Easter Island represented Muan colonial art, that the temples of Southeast Asia and Central America derived from Muan architectural traditions, and that the religious symbols found across diverse Pacific cultures showed unmistakable Muan influence. Churchward claimed to have identified a system of symbolic writing that appeared consistently throughout these different regions, demonstrating their common origin in the mother civilization of Mu. He published detailed drawings of these symbols and their supposed meanings, creating an elaborate system of interpretation that allowed almost any ancient inscription or decorative pattern to be read as evidence of Muan origin. The scientific problems with Churchward's theory were immediately apparent to anyone with basic knowledge of geology or Pacific archaeology. The Pacific Ocean floor consists primarily of oceanic crust, a type of geological material that forms at mid-ocean ridges through volcanic activity, and that cannot support the thick continental crust necessary for a large landmass like the one Churchward described. The ocean basins are geologically ancient, with the Pacific floor in most places having formed tens of millions of years before the evolution of modern humans, and there is no geological mechanism that could have sunk a continent-sized landmass within the time frame Churchward proposed. Oceanographic surveys conducted throughout the 20th century would repeatedly confirm that no such continental remnants exist anywhere in the Pacific, and the evidence of Pacific plate tectonics would eventually demonstrate conclusively that the continental configuration Churchward imagined was physically impossible. The archaeological claims were equally problematic when examined by trained researchers. The supposed similarities between Pacific Island cultures, Mesoamerican civilizations, and Southeast Asian societies that Churchward cited as evidence of common Muan origin could be explained far more parsimoniously by the well-documented patterns of human migration and cultural diffusion that archaeologists had already begun to trace. The independent development of similar cultural features in different regions, a phenomenon anthropologists call convergent evolution, meant that apparent similarities did not necessarily indicate historical connection. The specific artistic and architectural features Churchward identified as Muan signatures could be shown to have developed independently in each region, following local traditions and using local materials in ways that demonstrated no actual historical relationship to a common Pacific homeland. But Churchward's book was not written for scientists. It was written for a popular audience hungry for mysteries and ancient secrets, and it sold remarkably well. The Lost Continent of Mu went through multiple editions and printings throughout the late 1920s and 1930s, and Churchward followed it with several sequel volumes expanding his Mu theory and applying it to new archaeological puzzles. He presented his claims with the confident authority of a military officer and gentleman explorer, and his writing style combined sweeping historical narrative with just enough technical-sounding terminology to create an impression of scholarly rigour. Readers who had no way to evaluate his geological or archaeological claims found his account of Mu compelling, and his dismissal of scientific skepticism convincing. The book established Mu as a permanent fixture in the alternative history genre, inspiring subsequent generations of writers who would adopt, modify, and expand Churchward's basic framework. The question of whether Churchward genuinely believed his own claims or knowingly fabricated them has never been definitively resolved. The Narcal tablets that supposedly formed the foundation of his knowledge have never been produced, examined, or verified by any independent scholar, and Churchward's descriptions of how he learned to read them varied significantly between different accounts. Some researchers who have examined Churchward's biography have suggested that his military service in India may have been considerably less extensive than he claimed, raising questions about whether he could have spent the years studying with temple priests that his narrative required. His interpretations of archaeological remains show a consistent pattern of selective attention, emphasizing features that could be made to support his theory while ignoring evidence that contradicted it, a pattern more consistent with deliberate construction of a narrative than with genuine scholarly investigation. But whether Churchward was a sincere believer who deceived himself, or a calculating fraud who deceived his readers, the effect of his publications was to establish Mu as a recognised alternative history concept that would persist long after his death in 1936. The influence of Churchward's Mu theory extended well beyond the readers of his books. The concept of a lost Pacific civilization entered popular culture through novels, films, and eventually television programs that drew on the imagery and ideas Churchward had popularized. The association between Pacific Island cultures and mysterious ancient wisdom that continues to shape Western perceptions of Polynesian societies owes something to the Mu literature, which portrayed contemporary Pacific Islanders as the degraded descendants of a far more sophisticated original civilization. This framing, with its implicit suggestion that indigenous peoples could not have achieved their documented accomplishments without assistance from a hypothetical superior race, reflected the racial assumptions common in early 20th century thought and has been criticised by modern scholars as a form of archaeological racism. The real achievements of Pacific Island peoples, including the remarkable navigational abilities that allowed Polynesian explorers to settle islands across thousands of miles of open ocean, deserve recognition on their own terms rather than through the distorting lens of lost continent mythology. The decades following Churchward's death saw continued publication and promotion of Mu theories by various authors, some of whom added new supposed evidence while others simply recycled Churchward's material with minor modifications. The emergence of New Age spirituality in the 1960s and 1970s provided a new context for Mu beliefs, as the lost continent was incorporated into various mystical and metaphysical frameworks, alongside Atlantis, Lemuria, and other hypothetical ancient civilizations. Some New Age writers claim to receive information about Mu through channeling or past life memories, sources that place their claims entirely beyond the reach of scientific verification, while providing detailed and emotionally compelling accounts of Muon society and its destruction. The integration of Mu into New Age belief systems ensured its survival as a cultural concept even as mainstream science moved further away from any possibility of taking it seriously. The scientific investigation of Pacific geology and archaeology during the 20th century provided increasingly detailed understanding of how the Pacific Ocean had actually formed and how its islands had been populated. The theory of plate tectonics, which emerged in the 1960s and became scientific consensus by the 1970s, explained the geological structure of the Pacific Basin in ways that definitively ruled out the existence of a former continent. The Pacific Plate, one of the Earth's largest tectonic plates, consists almost entirely of oceanic crust that has formed continuously at the East Pacific Rise and has been steadily subducting beneath surrounding continental margins for tens of millions of years. The islands of the Pacific are either volcanic in origin, formed by hotspots beneath the oceanic crust as the plate moves over them, or consist of coral atolls built up on volcanic foundations that have subsided over geological time. Neither type of island represents the remnant of a sunken continental landmass, and the geological evidence shows no indication that any such landmass ever existed within the Pacific Basin. The archaeological investigation of Pacific Island cultures has similarly provided detailed understanding of when and how these islands were settled by human populations. Modern genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence demonstrates that the Pacific Islands were settled relatively recently in human history, with expansion from Southeast Asia beginning approximately 5,000 years ago and reaching the most remote islands of Polynesia only within the last 1,000 years. The sophisticated navigation techniques, agricultural practices, and artistic traditions found across Pacific societies developed from this relatively recent base, spreading and differentiating as populations expanded across the oceanic realm. The apparent similarities between different Pacific cultures that Churchward interpreted as evidence of common Muon origin actually reflect this documented historical process of expansion and diversification from Southeast Asian ancestors, a pattern that requires no hypothetical lost continent to explain. The case of Easter Island, which Churchward and other Mu theorists frequently cited as evidence for their hypothesis, illustrates how scientific investigation has replaced speculation with documented history. The famous Moai statues that have made Easter Island an iconic image of ancient mystery were carved and erected by Polynesian settlers who arrived on the island approximately 800 to 1,000 years ago, part of the same expansion process that settled the rest of Polynesia. Archaeological investigation has documented the quarries where the statues were carved, the techniques used to transport them to their final locations, and the social and religious systems that motivated their construction. The supposed mystery of Easter Island dissolves under scientific examination, revealing a documented case of human achievement by identifiable historical populations using understandable techniques and motivations. The real story of Easter Island is remarkable and impressive without requiring any appeal to lost continents or ancient super-civilizations. Yet despite more than a century of scientific refutation, belief in Mu continues to persist among certain communities of alternative history enthusiasts. The internet has provided new platforms for Mu believers to share supposed evidence, debate interpretations, and attract new adherents to the theory. Books on Mu continue to be published and sold, some reprinting Churchward's original texts, and others offering new variations on the basic theme. Documentaries and television programs occasionally present Mu as a legitimate mystery, worthy of investigation, typically framing the scientific consensus as merely one perspective among several rather than as the conclusive resolution it actually represents. The persistence of Mu belief, despite overwhelming scientific refutation, raises important questions about how alternative historical theories gain and maintain adherents, and about the cultural and psychological factors that make lost continent narratives so enduringly appealing. The appeal of Mu, like the appeal of Atlantis and other lost civilization theories, draws on deep human fascinations with the idea that the past was grander than the present, that ancient peoples possessed wisdom that modernity has lost, and that the visible record of history conceals more exciting secrets than surface examination reveals. These fascinations are not entirely illegitimate, as archaeological discovery has repeatedly shown that past civilizations were more sophisticated than earlier scholars recognized, and as the fragmentary nature of the archaeological record means that significant aspects of human history may indeed remain unknown. The problem with Mu theories lies not in the general interest in ancient history that motivates them, but in the specific claims they make about events and places that could not have existed as described, and in the methods of argument that substitute imagination for evidence and enthusiasm for rigour. The distinction between legitimate archaeological mystery and unfounded speculation can sometimes be difficult to draw, particularly for audiences without specialised training in the relevant scientific disciplines. Ancient history does contain genuine puzzles that continue to motivate scholarly investigation, including questions about early human migration, the origins of agriculture and urban life, and the development of writing and other cultural technologies. The resolution of these puzzles requires careful attention to evidence, rigorous methodology, and willingness to revise conclusions when new data becomes available, all qualities that distinguish genuine scholarship from the alternative history genre. The story of how Pacific archaeology has developed from speculation to documented understanding illustrates the difference between these approaches and the value of scientific methodology in reconstructing the human past. The environmental and geological investigation of the Pacific Basin has been no less dramatic than the archaeological research, transforming understanding of how ocean basins form and change over geological time. The deep-sea drilling programs of the 1960s and later decades retrieved core samples from the Pacific floor that documented hundreds of millions of years of geological history, showing the continuous processes of crustal formation and subduction that have shaped the basin. Underwater surveys using increasingly sophisticated sonar and imaging technology have mapped the Pacific floor in extraordinary detail, revealing seamounts, trenches, spreading centres, and other features that record the tectonic processes governing oceanic geology. None of this investigation has produced any indication of former continental masses that might correspond to the Mu hypothesis, and the theoretical frameworks that explain observed geological features leave no room for such masses to have existed. The transformation of the Mu concept from a scholarly hypothesis about Mayan translations to a fixture of popular alternative history illustrates broader patterns in how pseudo-scientific beliefs develop and spread. The original claims by Brasseur de Bourbourg, while ultimately incorrect, emerged from genuine engagement with difficult scholarly problems and were presented in venues where they could be evaluated and criticised by other researchers. The rejection of these claims by the scholarly community reflected the normal operation of academic discourse, as researchers identified methodological problems and alternative explanations that undermined the original hypothesis. But the popular appeal of lost continent narratives meant that the rejected theory could find new life outside academic channels, promoted by writers who faced no requirement to respond to scholarly criticism and whose success depended on audience enthusiasm rather than peer evaluation. The transformation of Mu from scholarly speculation to popular belief depended heavily on the mechanisms through which alternative historical ideas spread during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The expansion of literacy, the growth of popular publishing, and the increasing public interest in ancient mysteries created fertile ground for theories that promised access to hidden knowledge unavailable through conventional educational channels. Writers who promoted Mu and similar theories positioned themselves as truth-tellers, exposing the limitations of academic orthodoxy, a stance that appealed to audiences who felt excluded from or skeptical of institutional expertise. This positioning created a rhetorical framework in which scholarly rejection actually reinforced, rather than undermined, the appeal of alternative theories, as each criticism from academic sources could be reinterpreted as evidence that the theory threatened established interests or challenged comfortable assumptions. The dynamics of this alternative knowledge economy help explain why Mu beliefs persisted and evolved despite consistent scientific refutation, and why new generations of believers continued to find the lost continent theory compelling even as geological and archaeological evidence against it accumulated. The role of theosophy and related esoteric movements in promoting Pacific lost continent theories cannot be separated from the broader cultural context of late 19th century spiritualism and occultism. The period between approximately 1870 and 1920 witnessed an extraordinary flowering of movements claiming access to hidden spiritual truths, many of which drew on invented or misunderstood versions of Asian religious traditions to construct elaborate cosmological systems. Helena Blavatsky's Theosophical Society, founded in 1875, became perhaps the most influential of these movements, promoting a complex doctrine that combined elements drawn from Hinduism, Buddhism, and Western esoteric traditions into a comprehensive account of human spiritual evolution. Central to theosophical cosmology was the concept of root races, successive stages of human development that supposedly occurred across vast spans of time and involved civilizations on continents that have since vanished. The Lemurian root race, in theosophical teaching, inhabited a continent in the Indian and Pacific Oceans before its destruction through geological catastrophe, while the Atlantean root race developed subsequently on the Atlantic continent before meeting a similar fate. These teachings provided a framework within which Pacific lost continent theories could be integrated into larger spiritual narratives, transforming what had begun as linguistic speculation about Mayan texts into cosmic history, involving the spiritual evolution of humanity across millions of years. The influence of theosophical ideas on popular understanding of lost civilizations extended far beyond the relatively small membership of formal theosophical organizations. Writers who drew on theosophical concepts reached broad audiences through popular books, magazine articles, and lectures that presented lost continent theories as recovered ancient wisdom rather than modern speculation. The authority claimed by these writers rested not on archaeological evidence or geological research, but on purported access to spiritual traditions, clairvoyant perception, or texts from lost civilizations that had supposedly survived in fragmentary form. This mode of authority differed fundamentally from the scientific methodology developing in archaeology and geology during the same period, as it offered certainty based on revelation rather than provisional conclusions based on evidence. The contrast between these approaches created distinct communities of belief, organized around different standards for evaluating claims about the past, a division that would prove remarkably durable throughout the 20th century and into the present day. The geographic scope of theosophical lost continent theories expanded considerably beyond the original claims about Pacific and Atlantic landmasses. Writers working within and adjacent to the theosophical tradition proposed lost civilizations in virtually every part of the world, from the Gobi Desert to Antarctica to the region beneath the modern Sahara. These proposals shared common features that distinguished them from legitimate archaeological hypotheses, including reliance on mystical rather than empirical methods of investigation, claims of vast antiquity that placed proposed civilizations before the established timeline of human evolution, an attribution of advanced technologies or spiritual knowledge that supposedly exceeded anything known to documented historical societies. The multiplication of lost civilization theories created a genre of alternative history literature that provided readers with an endless supply of hidden knowledge to discover, each new theory building on and reinforcing the others in a self-sustaining system of belief. Within this system, Mu occupied a prominent position as one of the oldest and most elaborately described of the proposed lost continents, its status enhanced by the continuing publication of new books claiming to provide additional information about its supposed civilization. The relationship between Mu theories and Asian religious traditions was complex and often problematic from the perspective of scholars studying those traditions. Writers promoting Mu frequently claimed that their theories explained the origins of Buddhism, Hinduism, and other Asian religions, proposing that these traditions preserved fragmentary memories of the lost Pacific civilization. Such claims typically rested on superficial similarities between religious symbols, architectural styles, or philosophical concepts rather than on rigorous comparative analysis, and they often misrepresented the actual content and history of the traditions they claimed to explain. The assertion that Asian religions derived from a lost Pacific source also carried implicit assumptions about cultural priority and influence that reflected Western frameworks for understanding religious development rather than the self-understanding of the traditions themselves. Scholars working within religious studies and anthropology largely rejected these derivation claims, recognizing them as reflecting more about modern Western interests in exotic origins than about the actual historical development of Asian religious traditions. The archaeological investigation of Pacific cultures during the 20th century produced increasingly detailed understanding of how human populations actually reached and settled the islands scattered across the ocean basin. The study of Polynesian navigation and settlement represented one of the most remarkable achievements of archaeological and anthropological research, revealing the extraordinary maritime capabilities that enabled human colonization of some of the most remote islands on Earth. Beginning perhaps 3,000 years ago with migrations from Southeast Asia into the islands of Melanesia, successive generations of Pacific Islanders developed navigation technologies and techniques that allowed them to cross thousands of miles of open ocean in double-hulled canoes. These voyages, accomplished without metal tools, written records, or instruments beyond those that could be constructed from available organic materials, represented feats of navigation and seamanship that modern scholars came to regard as among the greatest achievements in human maritime history. The settlement of Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and Aotearoa, the furthest reaches of the Polynesian Triangle, required not just successful voyages but sustained contact that enabled the transportation of people, animals and plants necessary to establish viable settlements on previously uninhabited islands. The evidence supporting this understanding of Pacific settlement derived from multiple independent sources that converged on consistent conclusions. Linguistic analysis showed that Polynesian languages formed a closely related family descending from ancestral tongues spoken in Southeast Asia, with patterns of similarity and difference that traced the roots and timing of migration across the Pacific. Archaeological excavation revealed sequences of cultural change on individual islands that could be dated through radiocarbon analysis, showing when different islands were first settled and how their cultures developed subsequently. Biological evidence, including the spread of characteristic Pacific crops like breadfruit, taro and coconut, documented the intentional transportation of agricultural resources across oceanic distances. Genetic studies in more recent decades have added additional confirmation, showing that Pacific Island populations derive from Southeast Asian ancestors who migrated through the region over the past several millennia. The convergence of these multiple lines of evidence created a robust understanding of Pacific settlement that left no room for a prior continental civilization that preceded documented historical populations. The methodological sophistication of Pacific archaeological research developed considerably over the course of the 20th century, as researchers refined their techniques and expanded their theoretical frameworks. Early archaeological work in the Pacific often reflected assumptions derived from Western archaeological traditions, including emphasis on monumental architecture and material culture, that paralleled European prehistoric research. Later scholarship developed more nuanced approaches that recognized the distinctive character of Pacific Island societies and the particular challenges of archaeological investigation in tropical island environments. The study of portable artifacts gave way to more comprehensive analysis of settlement patterns, environmental modification, and subsistence systems, revealing the complex adaptations that enabled human communities to thrive on islands with limited terrestrial resources. Ethno-archaeological research, which combined archaeological methods with ethnographic observation of contemporary traditional practices, proved particularly valuable in understanding how Pacific Islanders had used their environments and organised their societies before European contact transformed these patterns. The question of pre-Columbian contact between Pacific Islands and the Americas attracted sustained scholarly attention throughout the 20th century, though the evidence remained contentious and the implications were often misunderstood by popular audiences. The presence of the sweet potato, a plant of South American origin, in Polynesian cultures before European contact suggested some form of trans-Pacific exchange, though scholars debated whether this indicated Polynesian voyages to South America, South American voyages to Polynesia, or some other mechanism of transfer. The distribution of other potentially diagnostic plant species, cultural practices, and artifacts was examined for evidence of contact, though many proposed similarities proved upon closer analysis to reflect convergent development rather than historical connection. The scholarly consensus that emerged by the late 20th century accepted that some contact between Polynesia and South America had likely occurred, probably involving Polynesian voyages to the South American coast, but rejected the more elaborate theories of sustained cultural exchange or colonization that some writers had proposed. This consensus was entirely compatible with mainstream archaeological understanding of Pacific settlement and provided no support for lost continent theories proposing that a prior civilization had preceded both Polynesian and American cultures. The interpretation of Pacific Island architecture proved particularly susceptible to alternative historical speculation, as the impressive stone structures found on certain islands seemed to some observers inconsistent with construction by the small populations documented during European contact. The moai of Rapa Nui, the massive stone statues that have become the island's most famous cultural artifacts, attracted theories proposing construction by earlier civilizations with technologies or labour forces unavailable to the historical Rapa Nui people. Similar speculation surrounded the megalithic structures of Nan Madol in Micronesia, the temple complexes of Tonga and Samoa, and various other Pacific archaeological sites. These theories typically underestimated the organizational capabilities of pre-contact Pacific societies while overestimating the technical requirements of the construction projects in question. Experimental archaeology, which involved attempts to replicate ancient construction techniques using available materials and realistic labour estimates, demonstrated that proposed monumental projects were feasible for documented Pacific Island populations without requiring intervention from hypothetical lost civilizations. The carved stone statues of Rapa Nui, for example, were shown to be movable using wooden sledges and rope systems operated by work teams of reasonable size, contradicting claims that their transportation required technologies beyond those available to Polynesian societies. The environmental history of Pacific Islands also bore on questions about their settlement and cultural development, as understanding of past climate conditions, sea levels, and ecological systems provided context for interpreting archaeological evidence. Research on sea level changes showed that Pacific coastlines had been considerably different during the last glacial maximum, when water locked in continental ice sheets lowered ocean levels by more than 100 metres. This meant that some islands which are now separated were formerly connected, while other areas that are now land were formerly submerged. The timing and pattern of sea level rise as glaciers melted at the end of the last ice age created particular conditions for Pacific Island settlement, affecting both the routes available to maritime migrants and the resources available on the islands they encountered. Understanding this environmental context proved essential for interpreting early settlement sites, many of which were now submerged or eroded by changing sea conditions. None of this environmental research, however, supported the existence of a former Pacific continent, as the geological evidence consistently showed that the Pacific basin had been oceanic throughout the entire period of human existence. The persistence of Mu beliefs. Despite this, accumulating scientific evidence reflected broader patterns in how alternative historical communities maintained their beliefs against mainstream scholarly consensus. The alternative history literature that promoted Mu and similar theories developed rhetorical strategies for neutralizing scientific criticism, including assertions that academic researchers were biased against unconventional ideas, that important evidence was being suppressed or ignored, and that future discoveries would vindicate currently rejected theories. These strategies created closed interpretive systems within which any evidence could be accommodated. A supporting evidence confirmed the theory, while contradicting evidence demonstrated the conspiracy against it. The social dynamics of alternative history communities reinforced these interpretive patterns, as believers found validation and community among others who shared their convictions and viewed skepticism from outsiders as confirming their special insight. The internet would later dramatically accelerate these dynamics, creating platforms where alternative historical communities could form and flourish outside any contact with mainstream scholarship or critical evaluation. The influence of Mu theories extended into surprising areas of 20th century culture, including movements that drew on lost continent concepts for purposes far removed from historical or archaeological speculation. New Age spirituality, which emerged as a recognizable cultural phenomenon in the 1960s and 1970s, frequently incorporated references to Lemuria, Mu, and other lost civilizations as sources of wisdom relevant to contemporary spiritual practice. Claims of past life memories from Lemurian or Mu incarnations became common in New Age contexts, transforming historical speculation into personal spiritual experience. The association of crystal healing, channeled messages, and various alternative healing modalities with supposed Lemurian origins reflected the continuing appeal of lost continent narratives as sources of spiritual authority. These developments carried the Mu concept far from its origins in Brasseur de Bourbourg's Mayan translations, demonstrating the remarkable adaptability of lost civilization themes to serve diverse cultural and spiritual purposes. The relationship between Mu theories and Japanese culture deserves particular attention, as the lost Pacific continent concept found unusually fertile ground in Japan during the 20th century. Churchward's books were translated into Japanese and achieved considerable popularity, and Japanese writers developed their own elaborations of the Mu theme that incorporated Japanese cultural elements and suggested special connections between Japan and the supposed lost continent. Some versions of these theories proposed that the Japanese people descended from Mu refugees, attributing the distinctiveness of Japanese culture to this supposed ancient heritage. The appeal of such theories in Japan reflected broader cultural currents involving questions of national identity, cultural uniqueness, and Japan's relationship to other Asian and Pacific civilizations. Government-sponsored archaeological research in Japan during the mid-20th century occasionally intersected with these alternative historical interests, though mainstream Japanese archaeology developed along lines consistent with international scholarly standards and rejected lost continent theories. The complicated history of Japanese archaeology, including notorious cases of fraudulent finds that briefly seemed to support claims of extreme antiquity for Japanese civilization, illustrated the pressures that popular interest in dramatic historical claims could place on legitimate scientific research. The oceanic archaeological research that developed during the latter half of the 20th century opened new possibilities for investigating the Pacific floor directly, using technologies that allowed observation and recovery of materials from depths impossible for human divers. Submersible vehicles, remotely operated cameras, and sophisticated sonar systems mapped the Pacific basin in unprecedented detail, revealing submarine volcanoes, mineral deposits, and the physical structure of oceanic crust. Deep-sea research stations recovered samples from the Pacific floor that documented geological processes operating over millions of years, showing the continuous creation and destruction of oceanic crust through plate tectonic mechanisms. None of this research produced any indication of former continental masses in the Pacific basin, and the theoretical frameworks that explained observed features provided no mechanism through which such masses could have existed and subsequently vanished. The Pacific floor revealed itself as geologically young compared to continental surfaces, with the oldest rocks dating to perhaps 200 million years ago and most of the basin consisting of much more recent formations. This timeline was utterly incompatible with claims about a Pacific continent existing within human history. as the geological evidence showed that no such continent had existed within the past several 100 million years. The development of satellite-based observation systems provided additional tools for understanding oceanic geology and confirming the conclusions of earlier research. Satellite altimetry measured minor variations in sea surface height that reflected gravitational variations caused by underwater features, allowing global mapping of submarine topography with remarkable precision. Satellite-based systems also track the movement of continental plates in real time, confirming the predictions of plate tectonic theory and demonstrating the dynamic processes reshaping Earth's surface. The integration of satellite data with ground-based measurements, seismic recordings, and other information sources created comprehensive understanding of how ocean basins form and evolve, understanding that reinforced the impossibility of former Pacific continents within the time frame proposed by Mu theorists. The accumulation of this evidence over decades of research created an overwhelming scientific consensus against lost Pacific continent theories, a consensus based on multiple independent lines of investigation that converged on consistent conclusions about the geological history of the Pacific Basin. The scientific consensus against Mu theories, however robust its foundations in geological evidence and methodological rigour, did not extinguish popular interest in the lost Pacific continent concept. The latter decades of the 20th century witnessed continued production of books, articles and other media presenting various versions of Mu claims to audiences who found such narratives more compelling than geological explanations of Pacific Basin formation. The gap between scientific understanding and popular belief regarding lost continents illustrated broader patterns in how knowledge circulates through modern societies, with technical expertise in fields like geology remaining largely inaccessible to general audiences, while simplified or dramatized alternative claims achieved wide distribution through commercial publishing and entertainment media. The publishing industry's continued investment in lost civilization narratives reflected market realities about reader interests that operated independently of scientific validity. Authors who presented Mu theories in accessible formats could reach audiences far larger than those who read geological journals, and the entertainment value of dramatic claims about ancient civilizations lost beneath the waves exceeded whatever satisfaction readers might derive from understanding plate tectonics or oceanic crustal formation. This commercial dimension of Mu literature influenced how claims were presented, with authors having incentives to emphasize the most dramatic elements of lost civilization narratives while minimizing or ignoring the scientific objections that would complicate their storylines. The result was a body of popular literature that accumulated over decades, creating an impression of mounting evidence for Mu claims when the actual situation involved repetition and elaboration of fundamentally flawed arguments. The relationship between Mu theories and the broader category of pseudoscience illuminated important questions about how societies distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate knowledge claims. Pseudoscientific theories typically share certain characteristics that differentiate them from genuine scientific research, including reliance on outdated or misinterpreted evidence, resistance to modification in response to criticism, claims of revolutionary significance that mainstream researchers supposedly suppress, and appeals to ancient or exotic sources of authority. Mu theories exhibited all of these characteristics, drawing on 19th century linguistic and archaeological interpretations that subsequent research had thoroughly discredited, while presenting themselves as recoveries of suppressed ancient knowledge that establishment scientists refused to acknowledge. The persistence of such theories, despite overwhelming contrary evidence, raised questions about the social and psychological functions that pseudoscientific beliefs served for their adherents, functions that evidently did not require empirical validation to operate effectively. The appeal of Mu theories to certain psychological and emotional needs helped explain their persistence in the face of scientific refutation. Lost civilization narratives offered explanations for cultural achievements that seemed otherwise mysterious, satisfying a desire for comprehensive understanding that tolerated gaps in conventional historical knowledge poorly. The idea that ancient peoples possessed advanced knowledge subsequently lost to cataclysm provided a framework for interpreting archaeological sites, cultural traditions, and artistic achievements without requiring the difficult work of understanding how human societies actually develop complex capabilities over long periods of time. The notion of a golden age followed by catastrophic decline resonated with pessimistic assessments of contemporary civilization, while offering hope that such cycles might eventually lead to renewed flourishing. These emotional and psychological dimensions of Mu beliefs operated at levels that scientific evidence could not directly address, helping to explain why geological proofs of Pacific Basin formation failed to eliminate interest in the lost continent concept. The development of internet communication technologies during the final decades of the 20th century and the opening years of the 21st created new environments for the propagation of alternative historical theories, including Mu claims. Online forums, websites, and eventually social media platforms allowed believers in lost civilizations to form communities, share information, and reinforce each other's convictions in ways that had been impossible when such interests depended on physical proximity or mail-order correspondence. The democratizing effects of internet communication meant that alternative historical claims could reach audiences without passing through the editorial gatekeeping that had previously limited the distribution of such material, while search algorithms that prioritized engagement over accuracy could direct curious users toward the most dramatic rather than the most reliable sources of information. These technological developments created conditions in which Mu theories and similar alternative historical claims could achieve visibility and apparent credibility that belied their scientific standing. The visual capabilities of internet platforms proved particularly important for the dissemination of lost civilization claims, as proponents could share images of archaeological sites, geological formations, and artistic representations that seemed to support their arguments, regardless of whether professional analysis would sustain such interpretations. Photographs of underwater rock formations in various Pacific locations circulated online, with captions identifying them as Mu ruins, while images of megalithic structures from around the world were compiled into presentations suggesting patterns of cultural connection that mainstream archaeology rejected. The ease with which such visual materials could be decontextualized, misattributed, or selectively presented created challenges for those attempting to correct misinformation, as the dramatic impact of compelling images often exceeded the persuasive power of careful textual analysis, explaining why particular interpretations were incorrect. The Yonaguni Monument controversy that emerged during the 1980s and continued into subsequent decades provided a case study in how underwater geological formations could become focal points for lost civilization claims. Located off the coast of Yonaguni Island in Japan's Ryukyu archipelago, the Yonaguni Monument consisted of a series of rock formations on the seafloor that exhibited geometric shapes suggesting artificial construction to some observers. The discoverer of the site, a diving instructor named Kiichiro Arataki, encountered the formations in 1986 while searching for hammerhead shark observation points, and photographs of the angular rock surfaces attracted attention from researchers interested in possible prehistoric construction. Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist at the University of the Ryukyus, conducted extensive investigations of the site and concluded that the formation showed evidence of human modification, proposing that they represented the remains of an ancient city that had been submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age. The scientific debate surrounding the Yonaguni Monument illustrated the difficulties of distinguishing between natural geological processes and human construction in underwater environments. Critics of the artificial origin hypothesis pointed to the sedimentary rock type found at the site, which naturally fractures along regular planes that can produce geometric shapes without human intervention. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University who investigated the formations, concluded that they were primarily natural features shaped by geological processes, though he acknowledged that some evidence of minor human modification could not be entirely excluded. The dispute centered on questions of how to interpret specific features, with proponents of artificial origin emphasizing apparent stairs, terraces, and carved symbols, while skeptics explained the same features as products of natural erosion and fracturing. The technical nature of these arguments made definitive resolution difficult, and the site continued to attract visitors and researchers with varying perspectives on its origins. The connection between Yonaguni and Mu theories developed rapidly after the site gained international attention, with proponents of the lost Pacific continent concept seizing upon the formations as potential evidence for their claims. The location of the site within the Pacific Basin and its apparent age, potentially dating to periods when lower sea levels would have exposed the formation above water, fit well with narratives about ancient Pacific civilizations destroyed by geological catastrophe. Popular books and documentaries about Yonaguni frequently mention Mu or Lemuria, drawing explicit connections between the Japanese site and the broader tradition of lost continent speculation. These associations operated regardless of what professional geologists concluded about the artificial or natural origin of the formations, as the very existence of a mysterious underwater site with geometric features provided the kind of dramatic material that Mu narratives required. The Japanese cultural context surrounding Yonaguni interpretations added additional complexity to discussions of the site's significance. The location of the formations in Japanese territorial waters and their potential implications for understanding Japanese prehistory gave investigations particular resonance within Japan, where questions of cultural origins and national identity maintained considerable importance. Some Japanese researchers who investigated Yonaguni approached the site with expectations shaped by popular interest in theories connecting Japan to ancient Pacific civilizations, expectations that may have influenced their interpretations of ambiguous evidence. The international attention that Yonaguni attracted reflected both genuine scientific interest in the formations and the appeal of dramatic claims about underwater ruins that might reshape understanding of human history. Media coverage of the site often emphasized the most spectacular interpretations, while devoting less attention to the geological analyses that supported natural origins for the formations. The pattern established by Yonaguni repeated itself with other underwater sites around the Pacific and elsewhere, as rock formations, coral structures, and other submarine features attracted attention from researchers seeking evidence of lost civilizations. Each new site report generated cycles of media coverage, popular speculation, and eventually scientific investigation that typically concluded with natural explanations for features initially interpreted as artificial. The frequency of these cycles suggested that the human tendency to perceive pattern and purpose in natural formations, combined with the drama of underwater exploration, created recurring opportunities for lost civilization claims to gain temporary credibility. The difficulty of conducting thorough investigations in underwater environments meant that initial dramatic interpretations often circulated widely before careful analysis could be completed, establishing impressions in public consciousness that subsequent corrections struggled to displace. The relationship between lost civilization theories and mainstream archaeology revealed tensions between popular entertainment and scientific methodology that extended far beyond Mu claims specifically. Professional archaeologists frequently expressed frustration at the persistence of pseudo-historical narratives that contradicted established evidence while achieving far greater public visibility than legitimate research findings. The commercial success of books, television programs, and other media promoting alternative historical claims created incentives that worked against accurate representation of the archaeological record. As dramatic stories about ancient astronauts, lost continents, and forgotten civilizations attracted larger audiences than careful scholarship about the actual processes of cultural development, some archaeologists responded by engaging directly with popular media, attempting to provide accessible explanations of their discipline's methods and findings that could compete with pseudo-scientific narratives for public attention. The effort to counter lost civilization claims with scientific education faced significant challenges related to the nature of the claims themselves and the audiences who found them appealing. Believers in Mu theories often framed their rejection of scientific consensus as healthy skepticism toward established authority, positioning themselves as open-minded seekers of truth who refused to accept conventional limitations on historical possibility. This framing made scientific criticism appear as defensive suppression of challenging ideas, rather than application of methodological standards developed to distinguish reliable knowledge from speculation. The emotional investment that some believers developed in lost civilization narratives made them resistant to evidence that threatened cherished beliefs, a phenomenon familiar from many other contexts where established convictions conflicted with new information. The social dimensions of alternative historical communities, including the sense of belonging and special knowledge that participation provided, created additional barriers to acceptance of mainstream scientific conclusions. The continued production of Mu-related media during the early 21st century demonstrated the commercial viability of lost civilization content regardless of its scientific standing. Television programs examining mysteries of the ancient world regularly featured segments on Mu, Lemuria, and other supposed lost civilizations, presenting claims in formats that emphasized entertainment value over scientific accuracy. Documentary series that purported to investigate unexplained phenomena devoted episodes to Pacific lost continent theories, interviewing believers and presenting their claims with varying degrees of critical assessment. The entertainment industry's treatment of such material reflected commercial calculations about audience preferences rather than judgments about scientific validity, creating programming that could attract viewers regardless of whether the claims it presented had any basis in evidence. The integration of Mu concepts into fiction, including novels, films, and video games, created additional channels through which the lost continent idea reached contemporary audiences. Authors of science fiction and fantasy frequently incorporated lost civilization themes into their narratives, drawing on the rich imagery that decades of Mu literature had accumulated, while using fictional framing that freed them from obligations to historical accuracy. The boundaries between fictional treatment of Mu themes and supposedly factual presentations of Mu claims often blurred, as readers and viewers might encounter the same imagery and concepts across media that occupied different positions on the fiction-non-fiction spectrum. This blurring contributed to the general familiarity of Mu concepts, while potentially obscuring the difference between imaginative exploration of interesting ideas and claims about actual historical events. The academic study of Mu beliefs as cultural phenomena rather than historical claims developed during the latter 20th century and continued into the 21st, with researchers in fields including anthropology, religious studies, and the history of science examining the origins and persistence of lost continent theories. These scholarly investigations treated Mu claims not as potentially valid historical propositions requiring refutation, but as interesting examples of how alternative historical narratives emerge, develop, and maintain appeal despite scientific opposition. The cultural function served by Mu beliefs, the social contexts in which they flourished, and the psychological mechanisms that made them persuasive all became subjects of academic analysis, producing insights that illuminated both the specific case of Mu theories and broader patterns in the relationship between scientific knowledge and popular belief. The historiography of lost continent theories revealed how such narratives reflected the concerns and assumptions of the eras that produced them while adapting to changing cultural contexts. The 19th century origins of Mu theories connected to colonial expansion, racial classification schemes, and questions about cultural diffusion that preoccupied scholars of that period. The early 20th century elaboration of Mu claims by Churchward and others reflected anxieties about modern civilization, interests in Eastern spirituality, and searches for alternative sources of meaning that characterized those decades. The New Age appropriation of Lemuria during the latter 20th century served different functions related to environmental consciousness, rejection of materialism, and construction of syncretic spiritual practices. Each phase of Mu theory development drew on contemporary concerns, while maintaining continuity with earlier versions of the narrative, demonstrating the adaptability that allowed lost continent concepts to remain relevant across changing cultural circumstances. The persistence of Mu theories into the 21st century raised questions about the future trajectory of such beliefs in an era of unprecedented access to scientific information. Optimistic assessments suggested that improved science education and easier access to reliable sources might gradually erode the appeal of pseudo-historical claims, as curious individuals could more readily find accurate information about geological history, archaeological methodology, and the actual evidence regarding Pacific Basin formation. Pessimistic assessments pointed to the same information environment as creating conditions favourable to alternative beliefs, with search algorithms, social media dynamics, and declining trust in institutional authority potentially strengthening rather than weakening the position of lost civilization narratives. The fragmentation of information sources and the difficulty of establishing shared standards for evaluating claims in digital environments created uncertainty about whether the scientific consensus against Mu theories would achieve broader acceptance or face continued challenge from alternative communities with their own standards of evidence. The geological evidence against Mu theories continued to accumulate throughout the early decades of the 21st century as advancing technology permitted ever more detailed investigation of the Pacific floor and its history. Deep-sea drilling programs recovered core samples from locations throughout the Pacific Basin, providing direct evidence of the rocks that formed the oceanic crust, and their ages determined through radiometric dating methods. These samples consistently confirmed the relatively young age of the Pacific floor compared to continental surfaces, demonstrating that no portion of the basin preserved rocks old enough to have supported a continent during the period when human civilizations were developing. The integration of drilling data with seismic surveys, satellite observations, and other sources of information reinforced the plate tectonic model of Pacific Basin formation while providing no support whatsoever for lost continent hypotheses. The advances in understanding of Pacific geological history extended to increasingly detailed reconstruction of past configurations of land and sea, allowing scientists to model how coastlines and island distributions had changed over thousands of years in response to changing sea levels. These reconstructions showed that while significant areas now underwater had been exposed during glacial periods when sea levels were lower, the exposed areas consisted of the edges of existing continents and islands rather than lost continental masses in the central Pacific. The effects of sea level change on Pacific island populations and coastal communities around the basin RIM provided legitimate subjects for archaeological and anthropological investigation. But this research had no bearing on Mu claims about submerged continents in regions where the oceanic crust itself demonstrated that no such continents had existed. The sophistication of computer modelling techniques allowed researchers to simulate Pacific geological processes across millions of years, testing hypotheses about mantle convection, plate movement, and crustal formation against observed evidence. These simulations consistently confirmed the basic framework of plate tectonic theory, while revealing additional complexity in the processes that shaped the Pacific Basin over geological time. The movement of the Pacific Plate over hotspots in the underlying mantle created chains of volcanic islands that tracked plate motion with remarkable precision, providing yet another line of evidence confirming the dynamic processes that governed Pacific geology. The models left no room for former continents that could have existed and subsequently vanished, as the physical principles governing oceanic crust formation and destruction operated continuously throughout the relevant time periods and would have been detected in multiple independent lines of evidence if interrupted by continental presence. The implications of these geological models extended beyond the simple refutation of lost continent claims to illuminate the processes that had actually shaped Pacific geography and human settlement patterns across millennia. The volcanic island chains that decorated the Pacific surface represented not the remnants of sunken land masses, but rather the products of ongoing geological creativity, as molten rock rising from deep within the Earth's mantle punched through the overlying oceanic plate to create new land where none had existed before. The Hawaiian Islands exemplified this process with particular clarity, their northwestern to southeastern age progression demonstrating the steady movement of the Pacific Plate over a stationary hotspot that continued to produce new volcanic activity at the chain's southeastern end. Loihi Seamount, rising from the ocean floor south of the big island of Hawaii, represented the next island in the chain, its summit still thousands of feet below sea level, but growing incrementally through ongoing volcanic activity that would eventually produce a new Hawaiian island over geological timescales. The processes creating Pacific islands operated on temporal scales vastly different from those governing human civilizations, yet the islands themselves provided the platforms upon which human societies developed their distinctive cultures and navigational achievements. The remarkable voyaging traditions of Polynesian peoples represented genuine accomplishments that required no lost continent origin myths to explain, as the systematic colonization of islands scattered across millions of square miles of ocean demonstrated sophisticated navigational knowledge, boat-building technology, and social organization developed over generations of experience with Pacific environments. The archaeological evidence for Polynesian expansion across the Pacific revealed patterns of island colonization that followed logical progression from west to east, with earlier settlement dates in the western Pacific and progressively later dates as voyagers reached more distant island groups. Radiocarbon dating of occupation sites, analysis of artifact traditions, and genetic studies of both human populations and their associated plants and animals converged on a consistent picture of deliberate colonization rather than accidental drift or dispersal from some central Pacific homeland. The Lapita cultural complex, characterized by distinctive pottery traditions and associated with the ancestral populations of Polynesian peoples, appeared in the archaeological record of Near Oceania around 3,000 years ago before expanding eastward through remote Oceania over the following millennium. The trail of Lapita pottery, fishhooks, shell ornaments, and food remains documented the actual process by which Pacific Islands received their human inhabitants, a process that unfolded from established population centres in island Southeast Asia rather than from imaginary continents in the Central Pacific. The archaeological methodology that established these colonisation patterns relied on systematic excavation, careful stratigraphic analysis, and multiple independent dating techniques that together produced reliable chronologies for Pacific settlement. The contrast between this evidence-based reconstruction and the speculative claims of mu theorists illustrated the fundamental difference between scientific archaeology and pseudo-historical narrative construction. The linguistic evidence for Pacific settlement patterns complemented archaeological findings by revealing the historical relationships among Polynesian languages and their connections to the broader Austronesian language family. The systematic comparison of vocabulary, grammar, and sound correspondences across hundreds of languages spoken from Madagascar to Easter Island demonstrated that these languages descended from a common ancestor, spoken in Taiwan approximately 5,000 years ago. The branching pattern of linguistic relationships traced the expansion of Austronesian-speaking populations southward through the Philippines, eastward into island Southeast Asia and Melanesia, and eventually into the remote Pacific. The Polynesian languages themselves formed a closely related subgroup that shared innovations absent from more distantly related Austronesian languages, indicating their relatively recent common ancestry and the rapid expansion that had distributed them across the Pacific Triangle, bounded by Hawaii, New Zealand and Easter Island. Historical linguists could reconstruct aspects of the ancestral Polynesian vocabulary, including terms for sailing, navigation, food production, and social organisation that illuminated the lives of the voyagers who colonised the remote Pacific. This linguistic reconstruction supported the archaeological evidence for west to east expansion, while providing no support whatsoever for theories of Pacific origin or dispersal from a central continental homeland. The genetic evidence for Pacific population history accumulated rapidly during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as advances in DNA analysis permitted ever more detailed investigation of human genetic variation. Studies of mitochondrial DNA, inherited through maternal lines, and Y chromosome markers, inherited through paternal lines, revealed patterns of genetic diversity consistent with west to east expansion through the Pacific. The founding populations of remote Oceania carried genetic signatures that linked them to populations in island Southeast Asia and near Oceania, while lacking the deep genetic diversity that would have characterized populations with long indigenous histories in the Central Pacific. The genetic evidence extended to analysis of ancient DNA recovered from archaeological contexts, allowing direct comparison between modern populations and their ancestors at specific points in the settlement chronology. These ancient DNA studies confirmed the biological continuity between early settlers and their descendants, while revealing additional complexity in the population dynamics of Pacific colonization. The integration of genetic, linguistic, and archaeological evidence produced a robust reconstruction of Pacific settlement history that required no lost continents to explain, and indeed contradicted the central claims of mu theorists about human origins in a submerged Pacific homeland. The crops and animals that accompanied human settlers into the Pacific provided additional evidence for the direction and process of colonization. The sweet potato, taro, yam, breadfruit and other food plants that sustained Pacific Island populations could be traced to origins in Asia and the Americas, with their distribution patterns reflecting the roots of human dispersal rather than inheritance from some indigenous Pacific source. The chickens, pigs and dogs that appeared in Polynesian archaeological sites descended from Asian domesticated populations, their genetic signatures linking them to mainland and island Southeast Asian ancestors. The presence of the South American sweet potato in Polynesia before European contact indicated pre-Columbian voyaging connections across the Pacific, but this evidence supported a picture of long-distance voyaging between established land masses rather than dispersal from a central Pacific continent. The careful tracking of plant and animal genetics, combined with archaeological and linguistic evidence, produced a detailed picture of Pacific settlement that explained observed patterns far more convincingly than any lost continent hypothesis could offer. The oceanographic understanding of Pacific currents, winds and sailing conditions that developed through the 20th century illuminated the conditions that Polynesian navigators had exploited in their colonization of the remote Pacific. The trade winds and equatorial currents that dominated Pacific surface conditions created patterns of predictable movement that skilled navigators could use for deliberate voyaging. Modern experimental voyaging projects demonstrated that traditional navigation techniques, using observations of stars, ocean swells, bird flights, and other natural indicators, could guide voyages across thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments derived from Western technology. The Hokulea, a replica of traditional Hawaiian double-hulled voyaging canoes, completed numerous long-distance voyages beginning in the 1970s, demonstrating the practical effectiveness of traditional navigation methods and validating the oral traditions that described ancestral voyaging achievements. These experimental results confirmed that Polynesian colonization of the remote Pacific required no lost continents as stepping stones or origins, as the navigational technology and maritime knowledge of ancestral Polynesian peoples proved sufficient to accomplish the observed pattern of island settlement. The persistence of mu theories, despite overwhelming contrary evidence from geology, archaeology, linguistics, genetics, and oceanography, raised questions about the psychological and social functions that lost continent beliefs continued to serve for their adherents. The appeal of secret knowledge inaccessible to mainstream scholarship provided a sense of distinction and intellectual independence that some individuals found attractive regardless of the factual basis for such claims. The narrative of suppressed truth and institutional conspiracy appealed to broader patterns of distrust toward established authorities that characterized significant segments of contemporary society. The romantic vision of an advanced ancient civilization destroyed by catastrophe resonated with concerns about the fragility of contemporary technological civilization and the possibility that current achievements might prove similarly impermanent. The desire to find meaning in ancient mysteries and hidden connections appealed to spiritual and imaginative needs that strictly empirical approaches to the past did not satisfy for some audiences. These psychological and social functions operated independently of the factual accuracy of mu claims, ensuring continued interest in lost continent narratives regardless of the accumulating evidence against their historical reality. The relationship between mu theories and contemporary New Age spirituality demonstrated the integration of lost continent concepts into broader frameworks of alternative belief. The idea that ancient civilizations possess spiritual and technological knowledge subsequently lost to humanity fit comfortably within New Age narratives about humanity's spiritual potential and the possibility of recovering lost wisdom. Channeled messages purportedly from ancient Lemurian or Muan sources proliferated in New Age literature, claiming to reveal spiritual teachings preserved from the lost continent and now available to contemporary seekers. The Mount Shasta area of Northern California became a particular focus of Lemurian spirituality, with numerous authors and practitioners claiming that Lemurian survivors or their descendants inhabited caverns beneath the mountain and occasionally made contact with receptive humans. The bookstores, retreat centers, and tourism enterprises that catered to this Lemurian interest demonstrated the economic dimensions of lost continent belief, as the narrative of ancient wisdom preserved in California mountains attracted visitors seeking spiritual experiences unavailable through conventional religious institutions. The internet transformed the dissemination and evolution of mu theories in ways that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of lost continent enthusiasts. Online communities dedicated to alternative history and lost civilizations provided forums for sharing information, debating interpretations, and recruiting new adherents to various mu-related beliefs. The algorithmic curation of content on social media platforms and video sharing sites created pathways through which individuals expressing curiosity about ancient mysteries could be directed toward increasingly elaborate alternative historical narratives. The production values of amateur documentaries and video essays improved dramatically over the early decades of the 21st century, allowing mu proponents to present their claims with visual polish that enhanced their apparent credibility. The democratization of content creation meant that lost continent narratives no longer required the endorsement of publishers or broadcasters to reach audiences, as anyone with basic equipment could produce and distribute content promoting their preferred version of hidden history. The response of professional archaeologists and historians to the continued popularity of mu theories ranged from dismissive ignoring to active engagement and rebuttal. Some scholars argued that attention paid to pseudo-historical claims only amplified their visibility and lent them undeserved credibility through the appearance of controversy. Others contended that scientific professionals had an obligation to engage with public misconceptions and provide accessible alternatives to the misinformation circulating in popular culture. The growth of science communication as a professional field and the development of platforms specifically designed to address pseudoscience increased the availability of accurate information about Pacific history and geology. Websites, podcasts, and video channels dedicated to skeptical analysis of extraordinary claims examine mu theories alongside other alternative historical narratives, applying consistent standards of evidence evaluation and identifying the logical fallacies and evidentiary gaps that characterize lost continent arguments. The effectiveness of these debunking efforts remained difficult to assess, as the audiences consuming such content might differ substantially from the populations attracted to mu theories themselves. The educational dimensions of mu theory persistence highlighted broader questions about how societies transmitted scientific knowledge and cultivated critical thinking skills in their populations. The gaps between scientific consensus and popular understanding of topics such as plate tectonics, human evolution, and archaeological methodology created space for alternative narratives that offered more intuitively appealing explanations. The difficulty that many individuals experienced in evaluating the credibility of sources and distinguishing reliable evidence from speculation or fabrication contributed to the persistence of pseudo-historical claims across various domains. The challenges of teaching geological timescales, which vastly exceeded human intuitive grasp, made it difficult for general audiences to appreciate the evidence against lost continent theories that operated on timescales of millions rather than thousands of years. The integration of scientific literacy with historical understanding required educational approaches that connected abstract principles to concrete evidence in ways that competing narratives did not necessarily achieve as effectively. The cultural politics surrounding mu theories intersected with broader debates about the ownership and interpretation of the past. Some indigenous Pacific peoples expressed frustration that lost continent narratives displaced recognition of their ancestors' genuine achievements in favor of attributing Pacific cultures to imaginary foreign sources. The parallel between mu theories and earlier claims attributing indigenous accomplishments to visiting Egyptians, Phoenicians, or other external groups demonstrated the persistence of assumptions that indigenous peoples could not have developed sophisticated cultures independently. The racist implications embedded in many lost continent narratives, though often not explicit in contemporary presentations, reflected the colonial-era frameworks within which such theories had originally developed. The ongoing process of decolonizing Pacific history emphasized the recovery of indigenous perspectives and the recognition of local agency in cultural development, approaches fundamentally incompatible with narratives attributing Pacific achievements to sunken continental civilizations. The technical advances in underwater archaeology developed since the mid-20th century had dramatically expanded the capacity to investigate submerged sites in shallow coastal waters around the world. The discovery and excavation of ancient shipwrecks, submerged harbours, and coastal settlements inundated by rising sea levels demonstrated the genuine value of underwater archaeological investigation. Sites such as the submerged portions of ancient Alexandria, the underwater ruins of Dwarka in India, and the flooded caves containing Pleistocene human remains in Mexico showed that significant archaeological discoveries could indeed be made beneath the sea surface. However, these legitimate underwater archaeological investigations revealed nothing supporting lost continent theories, as the sites discovered represented the coastal margins of known land masses affected by documented sea level changes, rather than the remnants of continental surfaces that had never existed. The techniques of underwater archaeology that could investigate shallow coastal zones proved irrelevant to mu claims about continents in the deep Central Pacific, where the depths involved far exceeded the limits of any archaeological investigation, and where the oceanic crust itself demonstrated that no suitable surfaces for human habitation had existed within the relevant time periods. The mapping of underwater terrain throughout the Pacific Basin achieved remarkable precision during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, as multi-beam sonar systems mounted on research vessels systematically surveyed vast areas of ocean floor. These surveys revealed the full complexity of Pacific bottom topography, documenting seamounts, fracture zones, abyssal plains, and volcanic features in unprecedented detail. The resulting map showed clearly the distribution of geological features across the Pacific Basin, their relationships to plate boundaries and hotspots, and the absence of any structures that could represent the remnants of former continental surfaces. The satellite altimetry techniques that complemented ship-based surveys permitted global mapping of ocean floor topography by detecting the subtle variations in sea surface height caused by the gravitational influence of underwater features. These satellite observations provided coverage of regions rarely visited by research vessels, while confirming and extending the picture developed through direct surveys. The comprehensive mapping of Pacific bathymetry left no blank spaces where unknown continental remnants might lurk undiscovered, as the entire basin had been surveyed at resolution sufficient to detect any features of the scale proposed by mu theorists. The paleoclimatic research that reconstructed past environmental conditions throughout the Pacific region provided additional context for understanding the actual history of the basin and its human inhabitants. Ice cores from Antarctic glaciers, sediment cores from the Pacific floor, and other paleoclimate archives documented the environmental changes that had affected the Pacific over hundreds of thousands of years. These records revealed cycles of glacial and interglacial conditions that had dramatically affected sea levels, with maximum glacial conditions lowering sea level by approximately 130 metres below present levels. The exposure of additional land during glacial periods had significant effects on human populations and migration routes, particularly in the shallow seas of island Southeast Asia, where vast areas of continental shelf became inhabitable during low sea level stands. The flooded continental shelf region known as Sunderland had indeed supported human populations during the Pleistocene before rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age forced abandonment of coastal areas and migration to higher ground. However, Sunderland represented extended continental shelf on the margins of Asia rather than an independent continent in the Central Pacific, and its flooding occurred through the same gradual sea level rise documented globally rather than through catastrophic subsidence. The distinction between Sunderland and the hypothetical mu illustrated the fundamental difference between scientifically documented phenomena and pseudo-historical speculation, as the former represented well-understood geological and archaeological reality, while the latter contradicted everything known about oceanic geology and crustal dynamics. The populations that had inhabited the exposed continental shelves of Southeast Asia during glacial periods left abundant archaeological evidence of their presence, including stone tools, human remains, and evidence of maritime adaptation that demonstrated their real historical existence. The flooding of these shelf areas occurred gradually enough that human populations could migrate to higher ground, leaving descendants whose genetic and cultural heritage could be traced through the island populations of modern Indonesia, the Philippines, and adjacent regions. This documented history of human adaptation to sea level change stood in stark contrast to the catastrophic scenarios imagined by mu proponents, whose narratives required instantaneous continental submergence that would have left no survivors and no archaeological trace. The genetic evidence accumulated throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries provided increasingly detailed reconstructions of human population history throughout the Pacific region, tracing the movements and relationships of peoples across oceanic distances through the analysis of mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome markers, and eventually full genomic sequences. These genetic studies revealed the actual patterns of human migration into and across the Pacific, demonstrating the Southeast Asian origins of oceanic populations and the relatively recent colonization of the remote Pacific islands. The Polynesian expansion into the Central and Eastern Pacific emerged from these studies as a historical process occurring within the last 3,000 years, far too recent to support claims of ancient continental civilizations predating this migration by tens of thousands of years. The genetic distinctiveness of Pacific populations from hypothetical mu ancestors became apparent through comparison with populations worldwide, as the markers carried by Polynesian, Melanesian, and Micronesian peoples traced clearly to Asian ancestral populations rather than to any mysterious lost civilization. The linguistic evidence that had long supported the recognition of Austronesian cultural connections received reinforcement from genetic data showing that linguistic and genetic boundaries largely corresponded throughout the Pacific. The spread of Austronesian languages from Taiwan through island Southeast Asia and into the Pacific mirrored the genetic patterns revealed through molecular analysis. demonstrating that both language and ancestry reflected the same historical population movements. The reconstruction of Proto-Oceanic language and its daughter languages provided detailed evidence for the timing and pathways of Pacific colonization, with linguistic diversity patterns indicating the order in which different island groups received human settlers. This linguistic evidence contradicted Mu theories at every point, showing Pacific cultures to be the products of expansion from known Asian origins rather than survivors of continental catastrophe. The archaeological evidence for Pacific colonization similarly demonstrated the actual processes through which human populations had reached and inhabited the Pacific Islands, revealing patterns of adaptation, innovation, and cultural development that required no mysterious continental precursors. The Lapita cultural complex, identified through distinctive decorated pottery and associated artifact assemblages, marked the initial expansion of Austronesian peoples into the Western Pacific, beginning approximately 3,500 years ago. Lapita sites throughout island Melanesia, Western Polynesia, and Micronesia documented the material culture of the colonizing populations, their settlement patterns, their subsistence strategies, and their technological capabilities. The eventual development of the various Polynesian cultures from Lapita antecedents could be traced through archaeological sequences showing continuous local development rather than catastrophic replacement or mysterious outside influence. The settlement of Easter Island, New Zealand, and Hawaii represented the final stages of this expansion, reaching the most remote corners of the Pacific only within the last millennium through voyaging techniques developed and refined over generations of maritime exploration. The sweet potato transfer between South America and Polynesia, long cited by Mu proponents as evidence for their theories, received explanation through accumulating evidence for Polynesian contact with the South American coast, demonstrating that Pacific Islanders had possessed the navigational capability to reach the Americas and return with useful cultigens. This evidence for actual trans-Pacific contact made mysterious lost continents unnecessary, as explanations for cultural connections, while demonstrating the genuine maritime achievements of Pacific peoples. The radiocarbon dating of archaeological sites throughout the Pacific established firm chronologies for human presence on various island groups, consistently supporting the model of recent colonization from Western origins, rather than ancient indigenous development over tens of thousands of years. The precision of radiocarbon chronologies improved dramatically through the late 20th century with the development of accelerator mass spectrometry and increasingly refined calibration curves, permitting dates of greater accuracy and reliability than earlier techniques had allowed. These improved dates systematically confirmed the recentness of Pacific Island colonization, with most island groups showing initial human presence within the last 3,000 years, and the most remote islands receiving their first inhabitants within the last 1,500 years. The environmental archaeology that documented human impacts on Pacific Island ecosystems provided further evidence for the timing and processes of Pacific colonization, as the ecological changes associated with human arrival could be dated through multiple independent methods. The extinction of endemic bird species, the decline of native vegetation, the introduction of Polynesian cultigens and domestic animals, and the accumulation of cultural deposits all marked the arrival of human populations and could be detected in sediment cores, pollen records, and faunal assemblages. These environmental signatures consistently appeared at times corresponding to the archaeological evidence for first human settlement, reinforcing the chronology derived from artifact dating and demonstrating the absence of earlier human presence that Mu theories would require. The native species of Pacific Islands showed evolutionary patterns consistent with long isolation from human contact, developing the naivety toward predators and the reduced flight capability that characterize species on islands without terrestrial mammalian predators. The rapid extinction of many such species following human arrival demonstrated that Pacific Islands had indeed been uninhabited prior to Polynesian colonization, contradicting claims of ancient continental civilizations that would have left earlier signatures of human environmental impact. The persistence of Mu beliefs, despite this overwhelming contrary evidence, reflected the continuing appeal of lost civilization narratives to audiences seeking alternatives to conventional historical understanding. The emotional and ideological satisfactions provided by such narratives, including the sense of hidden knowledge, the appeal of ancient wisdom, and the flattering implication that believers possessed insights denied to conventional scholars ensured continued interest regardless of evidentiary considerations. The commercial market for alternative history content, encompassing books, television programs, websites, and lecture tours, created economic incentives for continued production of Mu-related material that reinforced audience interest while generating revenue for authors and producers. The Internet age that began in the 1990s transformed the dissemination of alternative historical claims, including those related to Mu and other lost continent theories, creating new platforms for belief communities, while simultaneously making scientific counter-evidence more accessible. The proliferation of websites devoted to Mu, Lemuria, and related topics during the early Internet period created networked communities of believers who could share information, reinforce each other's convictions, and coordinate responses to skeptical criticism. Forums, message boards, and eventually social media platforms permitted real-time discussion of lost continent theories, creating virtual communities that transcended the geographic limitations of earlier belief networks. The same digital infrastructure that enabled scientific communication also served alternative historical communities, with websites presenting Mu claims in formats mimicking scholarly publication, while lacking the peer review and evidentiary standards of actual academic work. The visual capabilities of digital media proved particularly useful for Mu proponents, as images of underwater rock formations, satellite photographs interpreted as showing continental outlines, and artistic reconstructions of imagined Mu civilization could be shared widely with audiences predisposed to accept alternative interpretations. The phenomenon of pareidolia, the human tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in random or ambiguous stimuli, received constant reinforcement through the circulation of images purporting to show artificial structures on the ocean floor or continental outlines visible from space. The absence of expert analysis or peer review for such images meant that misidentified natural features could circulate indefinitely within believer communities, acquiring accumulated interpretation that obscured their actual nature. The algorithms governing social media platforms and search engines created feedback loops that directed users interested in lost continent topics toward increasingly elaborate alternative claims, while potentially limiting exposure to skeptical or scientific responses. The formation of epistemic bubbles within which Mu beliefs received constant reinforcement, while contrary evidence received dismissal, illustrated broader patterns of information consumption in the digital age, patterns affecting many domains of knowledge beyond alternative history. The documentary format that had proven so influential in shaping public understanding of lost continent theories during the television era continued to reach mass audiences through streaming platforms and cable channels during the digital period. Productions such as Ancient Aliens, which premiered in 2010 and continued for numerous seasons, incorporated Mu and Lemuria references within broader frameworks, attributing human achievements to extraterrestrial intervention. The visual strategies developed for such productions, including dramatic reconstructions, suggestive editing, and the presentation of genuine scholars alongside alternative theorists in ways suggesting equivalent credibility, proved highly effective at reaching audiences seeking entertainment with educational veneer. The commercial success of such programming demonstrated continuing market demand for alternative historical content, while illustrating the challenges facing scientific communication in competition with more dramatic entertainment products. The frustration experienced by legitimate Pacific researchers, whose work became misrepresented or selectively cited in lost continent programming, reflected broader tensions between scientific accuracy and entertainment appeal in documentary production. The development of science communication as a professional field during this period represented partial response to these challenges, as researchers increasingly recognized the need to compete effectively in media spaces dominated by alternative narratives. However, the structural advantages enjoyed by dramatic entertainment over nuanced scientific communication ensured continued challenges for efforts to present evidence-based understanding of Pacific history to general audiences. The educational implications of persistent Mu beliefs extended beyond abstract questions of historical accuracy to affect actual understanding of Pacific peoples and their genuine achievements. The framing of Pacific cultural accomplishments as mysteries requiring exotic explanations perpetuated colonial-era assumptions about indigenous incapacity, while obscuring the actual skills, knowledge, and innovation that had enabled Pacific colonization and cultural development. Students encountering Mu theories before or alongside legitimate Pacific history risked developing distorted frameworks that made genuine understanding more difficult to achieve. The emphasis on mysterious stone structures and inexplicable navigation that characterized Mu-adjacent content obscured the mundane but remarkable processes through which Pacific peoples had actually developed their cultures, processes involving trial and error, accumulated experience, and the gradual refinement of techniques over generations. The romanticization of imagined ancient wisdom attributed to Mu provided false comfort compared to the genuine lessons available from actual Pacific history, including lessons about human adaptability, sustainable resource management, and the possibilities and limits of isolated cultural development. The treatment of Pacific Islanders as objects of speculation rather than subjects of their own history reflected continuing patterns of cultural appropriation that Indigenous scholars and activists increasingly challenged during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The growing presence of Pacific Islander scholars in academic discussions of their own heritage brought perspectives emphasizing Indigenous agency and the problematic nature of external theorizing about Pacific cultures. The geopolitical dimensions of Pacific history that legitimate scholarship increasingly addressed received no attention from Mu theorists, whose focus on imagined ancient civilizations ignored the actual historical experiences of Pacific peoples under colonialism and in the contemporary world. The nuclear testing that devastated communities in the Marshall Islands and French Polynesia during the mid-20th century, the military installations that transformed the political and economic landscape of Pacific territories, and the environmental challenges facing island nations due to climate change represented urgent historical and contemporary realities that lost continent speculation did nothing to illuminate. The contrast between genuine Pacific concerns and the escapist fantasies of Mu believers illustrated the fundamental irrelevance of alternative historical claims to the actual lives and challenges of Pacific peoples, the sovereignty movements, cultural revival efforts, and environmental activism that characterized Pacific Islander communities during the late 20th and early 21st centuries represented genuine historical processes demanding attention and understanding, processes that received minimal notice from audiences absorbed in speculation about imaginary continents. The climate change that threatened the physical existence of low-lying Pacific nations posed existential challenges requiring international attention and action, challenges obscured rather than illuminated by fantasies about ancient catastrophes and sunken civilizations. The scientific research that documented rising sea levels, ocean acidification, and changing weather patterns affecting Pacific communities represented actual knowledge of urgent importance, knowledge that received less popular attention than entertaining speculation about Mu and Atlantis. The scholarly community that studied Pacific history and archaeology continued developing increasingly sophisticated understanding of the region during this period, producing research that further widened the gap between scientific knowledge and alternative beliefs. The application of ancient DNA analysis to questions of Pacific population history permitted direct examination of genetic material from archaeological contexts, providing evidence for population relationships that supplemented the studies of living populations. These ancient DNA studies confirmed the Southeast Asian origins of Pacific colonizers, while revealing additional complexity in population history, including evidence for multiple migration waves and subsequent contact between different population groups. The refinement of paleoclimatic reconstruction through improved proxies and analytical techniques permitted more detailed understanding of the environmental conditions affecting human populations throughout Pacific history, including the climate variations that had influenced population growth, agricultural productivity, and social complexity in different island groups. The development of computational modelling approaches permitted simulation of possible colonization scenarios, testing hypotheses about navigation techniques, prevailing wind patterns, and the probabilities of successful voyaging between different island pairs. These modelling studies demonstrated the feasibility of Pacific colonization using the techniques and knowledge available to Austronesian seafarers, while identifying the most likely routes and timing for different stages of the expansion. The integration of archaeological, genetic, linguistic, and environmental evidence into comprehensive models of Pacific prehistory represented sophisticated interdisciplinary scholarship that rendered alternative explanations entirely unnecessary, while providing more satisfying and detailed understanding than any lost continent theory could offer. The material culture studies that examined the artifacts of Pacific peoples continued revealing the technical sophistication and aesthetic achievement of island cultures, demonstrating capabilities requiring no external explanation through lost civilization theories. The analysis of Polynesian voyaging canoes through both archaeological remains and ethnographic documentation showed the engineering principles underlying these remarkable vessels, principles developed through accumulated maritime experience rather than inherited from hypothetical continental ancestors. The astronomical knowledge embedded in traditional navigation systems received increasingly detailed documentation from researchers working with the few remaining practitioners of traditional wayfinding techniques, revealing sophisticated mental frameworks for organizing celestial and environmental observations. The agricultural systems developed on Pacific islands, including the intensive cultivation techniques of Polynesian terraces and Hawaiian fish ponds, demonstrated adaptive innovations specific to island environments rather than degraded remnants of continental agriculture. The bark cloth production, featherwork, and carving traditions of various Pacific cultures showed artistic and technical excellence that reflected local development and inter-island exchange rather than continental inheritance. The documentation and analysis of these genuine Pacific achievements provided understanding far richer than alternative theories could offer, revealing the actual creativity and skill of Pacific peoples through evidence rather than speculation. The museums housing Pacific collections increasingly engaged with questions of representation, repatriation, and indigenous perspectives during the late 20th and early 21st centuries, reconsidering how Pacific cultures should be presented to public audiences. The involvement of Pacific Islander communities in exhibition development and interpretation brought indigenous perspectives to bear on museum presentations, challenging earlier frameworks that had treated Pacific peoples as objects of external study. The repatriation of human remains and sacred objects to their communities of origin represented acknowledgement of past collecting practices that had violated indigenous rights and sensibilities, while beginning processes of healing and reconciliation. The educational programming developed by museums with Pacific collections increasingly emphasized genuine understanding of Pacific cultures over sensationalized mysteries, though alternative historical narratives continued influencing some visitors' expectations and interpretations. The tension between scholarly accuracy and popular appeal in museum contexts reflected broader challenges facing institutions attempting to communicate complex cultural and historical understanding to general audiences. The digital resources developed by museums during this period provided new means for sharing Pacific cultural heritage with global audiences, including audiences in Pacific communities seeking reconnection with ancestral traditions disrupted by colonialism. These digital initiatives represented constructive uses of technology for cultural preservation and education, contrasting with the spread of misinformation that characterized much alternative historical content online. The persistent appeal of Mu and related lost continent theories, despite overwhelming contrary evidence, invited examination through psychological and sociological frameworks that sought to understand why such beliefs maintained their hold on human imagination. The cognitive scientists and psychologists who studied belief formation identified several factors that helped explain the attraction of alternative historical narratives, including the human tendency toward pattern recognition that sometimes detected meaningful connections where none existed. The appeal of hidden knowledge and secret wisdom reflected psychological needs that scientific explanations of Pacific prehistory, however accurate, did not always satisfy in the same emotional register. The desire for enchantment in a world increasingly explained through naturalistic processes drove some individuals toward alternative frameworks that restored mystery and wonder to human history. The social dynamics of alternative belief communities provided fellowship and shared purpose that adherents found meaningful regardless of the accuracy of the specific claims around which these communities organized. The study of these psychological and social dimensions represented not dismissal of believers, but rather serious engagement with the human needs that alternative narratives addressed, needs that mainstream scholarship might consider how better to serve. The recognition that belief in lost civilizations fulfilled genuine psychological functions did not validate the historical claims themselves, but did suggest that simple refutation would never suffice to change minds that had found meaning through alternative frameworks. The legacy of lost continent theories in Pacific context extended into ongoing debates about how human societies should understand and respect indigenous knowledge systems while maintaining commitment to evidence-based inquiry. The appropriation of Pacific cultures by Western alternative historians had frequently occurred without consultation with or benefit to the Pacific Islander communities whose heritage was being misrepresented, raising ethical questions about who had the right to tell stories about Pacific history. The publication of books claiming that Pacific Islanders descended from lost continental civilizations had often presented these narratives without acknowledging that Pacific Islander communities had their own accounts of their origins, accounts that did not require external civilizations to explain their ancestors' achievements. The assertion that Pacific peoples could not have developed their remarkable cultures independently repeated colonial-era assumptions about indigenous incapacity, assumptions that Pacific Islander scholars and activists had worked to challenge and overcome. The irony that theories ostensibly celebrating ancient civilization actually diminished the achievements of actual Pacific peoples was not always recognized by those promoting these theories, whose admiration for hypothetical lost continents overshadowed appreciation for genuine Pacific accomplishments. The persistence of these theoretical frameworks into the 21st century meant that Pacific Islander communities continued encountering narratives that denied their ancestors' agency and creativity, requiring ongoing efforts to assert indigenous perspectives on Pacific history. The alternative archaeology community that maintained interest in lost Pacific continents during the early 21st century developed increasingly sophisticated media strategies for promoting their perspectives, utilizing podcasts, streaming video, and social media platforms to reach audiences who might never encounter mainstream archaeological scholarship. The democratization of media production and distribution enabled individuals without academic credentials to present alternative historical narratives with production values rivaling or exceeding those of educational programming produced by established institutions. The algorithm-driven recommendation systems of major platforms frequently directed users who had viewed one alternative historical video toward additional similar content, creating pathways that could lead from casual curiosity to deep engagement with alternative archaeological claims. The online communities that formed around shared interest in lost civilizations provided spaces where beliefs could be reinforced through interaction with like-minded individuals, while dissenting perspectives were often excluded or dismissed as evidence of closed-mindedness. The echo chamber dynamics of these communities made them resistant to corrective information, as members had access to extensive alternative content that explained why mainstream scholarship should be rejected. The monetization of alternative content through advertising, merchandise, and paid memberships created economic incentives for producing material that affirmed rather than challenged audience beliefs, as engagement and revenue depended on audience satisfaction rather than accuracy. These structural features of the contemporary media environment suggested that lost civilization narratives would continue finding audiences regardless of scientific evidence, as the systems distributing information operated according to logics other than accuracy or truth. The response of academic institutions and science communication organizations to the continued popularity of alternative historical claims remained somewhat uncertain throughout the early 21st century, as scholars debated whether engagement risked amplifying fringe theories, while recognizing that absence from popular discourse ceded the field to those promoting pseudoscientific claims. The public archaeology initiatives that sought to share genuine understanding of Pacific prehistory with general audiences faced challenges in competing for attention against more sensationalized alternatives that promised dramatic revelations rather than complex and nuanced understanding. The development of compelling science communication about Pacific archaeology required skills and resources that academic institutions did not always prioritize, leaving gaps that alternative content producers were happy to fill. The few archaeologists who developed significant public profiles as advocates for evidence-based understanding of Pacific history found themselves repeatedly addressing the same misconceptions, engaging in what sometimes felt like endless repetition against an ever-renewing supply of alternative claims. The question of how scientific institutions should respond to misinformation about human history remained unresolved, with different scholars advocating approaches ranging from complete disengagement to active intervention in public discourse. The recognition that scientific literacy alone did not determine acceptance of alternative claims complicated efforts at public education, as the appeal of lost civilization theories involved social, emotional, and identity factors that factual correction did not address. The examination of Mu beliefs as a cultural phenomenon rather than a historical question revealed patterns that illuminated broader aspects of how human societies generate, transmit and maintain beliefs about the past. The lost continent theory had undergone continuous transformation across its history, adapting to changing cultural contexts while maintaining certain core elements that defined it as a distinct tradition of speculation. The flexibility that permitted Mu to incorporate successive waves of evidence, from the Mayan codices through geological surveys to genetic studies, demonstrated how alternative frameworks could accommodate virtually any new information through creative reinterpretation. The stability of certain core claims across more than a century of refutation suggested that these claims served functions independent of their evidential basis, functions related to identity, meaning, and community rather than historical accuracy. The transmission of Mu beliefs from Churchward through subsequent popularizers to contemporary online communities revealed patterns of cultural evolution, with certain elements of the tradition proving more durable than others based on their appeal to audiences in different periods. The scholarly study of Mu as a cultural phenomenon contributed to understanding how all societies, including scientific ones, generated and maintained beliefs about the past, beliefs that always reflected present concerns regardless of their relationship to actual historical events. The contemporary Pacific Islander perspectives on lost continent theories varied considerably, with some community members finding such theories harmless, or even entertaining, while others viewed them as continuation of colonial appropriation of indigenous heritage. The scholars of Pacific Islander heritage, who had entered academic archaeology and anthropology, brought perspectives informed by their own cultural backgrounds, contributing to more nuanced understanding of how Pacific peoples understood their own histories. The integration of indigenous knowledge systems with scientific archaeological methods represented promising directions for future research, respecting traditional knowledge while applying rigorous evidence-based methodologies. The oral traditions that preserved Pacific Islander accounts of voyaging, settlement, and ancestral connections provided valuable information about how these communities understood their own pasts, information that sometimes complemented archaeological findings while reflecting different frameworks of significance and meaning. The increasing visibility of Pacific Islander voices in discussions of Pacific history challenged the dominance of external perspectives, whether mainstream archaeological or alternative historical, asserting indigenous rights to interpret and narrate Pacific heritage. The repatriation movements that sought return of cultural materials and ancestral remains to Pacific communities represented assertions of indigenous sovereignty over heritage that had been removed during colonial periods, challenging the institutional authority over Pacific cultures that museums and universities had long exercised. The geological and geophysical research that continued exploring Pacific basin structure during the 21st century utilized technologies of unprecedented sophistication, including networks of ocean bottom seismometers, high-resolution multi-beam bathymetric mapping, and satellite altimetry measurements that detected subtle gravitational signatures of subsea features. These investigations revealed the Pacific as a dynamic environment, continuously reshaped by tectonic processes operating across vastly different timescales, from the slow drift of plates to the sudden violence of earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. The understanding of Pacific geology that emerged from this research demonstrated the impossibility of a large stable landmass existing in the Central Pacific during any period that could have supported human civilization, confirming what geologists had recognized for over a century while adding detail and precision to that understanding. The submarine volcanoes, seamounts, and hydrothermal vent systems documented through deep-sea exploration revealed environments unlike anything on continental surfaces, ecosystems adapted to conditions that no land-dwelling civilization could have inhabited. The complete absence of geological evidence for a sunken continent, combined with theoretical understanding of why such evidence should exist if a continent had sunk, constituted definitive refutation of the physical claims underlying Mu theories, refutation that nevertheless failed to influence those for whom belief in Mu served purposes other than accurate understanding of geological history. The intersection of Mu beliefs with other alternative historical traditions created complex networks of mutually reinforcing claims as advocates for different lost civilization theories frequently cited each other's work as supporting evidence. The supposed connections between Mu, Atlantis, Lemuria, and various proposed prehistoric civilizations created a shadow historiography that explained human development through frameworks entirely different from those accepted by mainstream scholarship. The integration of lost continent theories with claims about ancient astronauts, forgotten technologies, and suppressed discoveries created alternative worldviews comprehensive enough to explain virtually any phenomenon through their interpretive frameworks. The social networks connecting believers in different alternative traditions facilitated exchange of ideas and arguments, strengthening commitment to alternative perspectives through community and shared identity. The opposition to mainstream scholarship that characterized these communities derived partly from this social solidarity, as rejection of one alternative claim might seem to threaten the entire framework of alternative understanding that adherents had adopted. The difficulty of changing minds that had integrated lost continent beliefs into broader alternative worldviews meant that Mu would likely persist as an element of popular culture, regardless of scientific evidence, maintained by communities whose identity had become connected to alternative historical frameworks. The educational challenges presented by lost continent theories extended beyond simple correction of factual errors to engagement with deeper questions about how people evaluate historical claims and distinguish reliable from unreliable sources. The media literacy necessary for navigating contemporary information environments required critical thinking skills that formal education did not always cultivate effectively, leaving many individuals vulnerable to compelling but inaccurate presentations. The emotional appeal of lost civilization narratives, combined with professional quality production and confident presentation, could overwhelm the less dramatic but more accurate accounts offered by mainstream scholarship. The development of educational approaches that could effectively counter alternative historical claims required understanding why such claims appealed and what needs they served, understanding that simple factual correction did not address. The recognition that alternative beliefs about history reflected genuine human needs for wonder, meaning and community suggested that effective education must offer more than refutation, providing positive engagement with the authentic mysteries and achievements that human history actually contained. The remarkable story of how Pacific peoples colonized the world's largest ocean, developing navigation techniques that guided them across thousands of miles of open sea, offered wonders that required no fictional continents to appreciate, wonders that education could help audiences discover and value. The narrative of Mu across its full history, from Augustus Le Plongeon's initial misreadings of Mayan texts through James Churchward's elaborate mythology to contemporary online revivals, illustrated recurring patterns in how alternative historical beliefs arose, spread, and persisted despite contrary evidence. The initial claims had emerged from genuine scholarly attempts to understand unfamiliar cultures, attempts constrained by the limited knowledge and unconscious biases of their time. The elaboration of those claims into comprehensive theories reflected the creative imagination of individuals who found meaning in constructing alternative histories, regardless of evidential support. The popularization of lost continent theories responded to public appetite for dramatic narratives about the human past, appetite that commercial publishers and media producers were happy to satisfy. The persistence of these theories, despite definitive refutation, reflected the social and psychological functions that alternative beliefs served, functions that factual accuracy did not affect. The transformation of Mu from scholarly hypothesis to popular mythology to fringe belief to internet content revealed how ideas evolved across changing media environments, adapting to new platforms while maintaining core elements that defined them as recognizable traditions. The study of this evolution contributed to understanding broader patterns of cultural transmission and transformation, patterns visible in the history of many beliefs beyond lost civilizations. The Pacific Ocean itself remained indifferent to human theories about its past, its waters concealing no sunken continents, but harbouring wonders beyond anything Churchward had imagined. The deep-sea ecosystems discovered through submersible exploration revealed forms of life adapted to conditions no surface dweller could survive, communities sustained by chemical energy from hydrothermal vents rather than sunlight penetrating from above. The volcanic islands that periodically emerged from the ocean surface demonstrated the ongoing geological processes that had built every Pacific island, processes continuing into the present rather than ending with some hypothetical ancient catastrophe. The coral reefs surrounding these islands harboured biodiversity rivaling that of tropical rainforests, ecosystems developed over millions of years through evolutionary processes, requiring no lost civilization to explain. The migratory species that traversed the Pacific, from whales crossing entire ocean basins to seabirds covering tens of thousands of miles annually, demonstrated natural navigation capabilities that had fascinated the same observers who found human navigation across the Pacific inexplicable. The actual Pacific, explored through patient scientific investigation, offered mysteries and wonders that fictional continents could not match. Mysteries grounded in evidence rather than speculation. The Polynesian voyaging societies that accomplished the Pacific's colonization had not required continental stepping stones, lost civilizations, or extraterrestrial assistance. They had developed, through accumulated knowledge transmitted across generations, the techniques necessary for intentional navigation across the world's largest ocean. The double-hulled voyaging canoes they constructed could carry sufficient people, provisions, plants, and animals to establish new communities on islands they had never previously seen. The mental frameworks they used for wayfinding, integrating observations of stars, waves, winds, wildlife, and clouds, permitted navigation to specific destinations across thousands of miles of open water. The social organization that supported these voyages, including the training of navigators, the construction of vessels, and the selection of colonizing groups, reflected sophisticated institutional development within island societies. The courage required to embark on voyages of unknown duration toward destinations that might not exist exceeded anything demanded by theories of continental inheritance. The genuine history of Pacific colonization demonstrated human capabilities that needed no diminishment through appeals to lost civilizations, capabilities reflecting the full creative potential of Homo sapiens operating within island environments. The question of why Mu persisted despite definitive refutation ultimately reflected the same psychological and social dynamics that had generated and maintained the theory across its history. The desire to believe in lost golden ages that had preceded the complications of the present, the appeal of hidden knowledge accessible only to those willing to look beyond conventional understanding, the satisfaction of belonging to communities that shared special insight unavailable to mainstream scholarship. These factors had sustained Mu through every scientific refutation and would likely continue sustaining it for generations to come. The lost continent that had never existed would continue existing in imagination, adapting to new contexts while maintaining the core appeal that had attracted believers since Churchward first brought Mu to public attention. The actual Pacific and its peoples would continue their histories independent of these imaginings, their genuine achievements offering meaning and wonder to those willing to engage with evidence rather than speculation. The sunken temples and stone cities of Mu would remain exactly where they had always been, which is to say nowhere outside the books, lectures, and websites that described them, monuments to human imagination rather than human construction. The story of Mu revealed human beings as creatures capable of generating elaborate beliefs about the past that served present psychological and social needs, regardless of their relationship to actual historical events. The creation of imaginary continents and lost civilizations reflected the same creative capacities that had produced genuine achievements in architecture, navigation, agriculture, and art. Capacities that could be directed toward fiction as easily as toward accurate understanding. The communities that gathered around shared belief in lost continents, demonstrated human sociality, operating through alternative frameworks, forming bonds and identities through commitment to claims that outsiders found implausible. The persistence of these beliefs, despite contrary evidence, illustrated the limits of factual correction, when beliefs were embedded in social relationships and personal identities, when abandoning a belief meant abandoning a community. The study of Mu as a cultural phenomenon rather than a historical question offered insights into human nature that transcended the specific claims of lost continent theorists, insights applicable to understanding belief formation and maintenance across many domains. The genuine Pacific, with its real islands, real peoples, and real histories, offered alternative objects of wonder for those seeking meaning in human relationships with the ocean, objects whose reality made them more rather than less remarkable. The waters of the Pacific continued their endless movement, waves crossing thousands of miles of open ocean, as they had for millions of years before any human being existed to observe them. The islands scattered across this vastness continued their geological lives, some sinking slowly beneath the waves while others rose from volcanic activity on the ocean floor. The peoples who inhabited these islands continued their cultural lives, adapting ancient traditions to contemporary circumstances, while maintaining connections to ancestral heritage that had guided their forebears across the seas. The scientists who studied the Pacific continued developing more sophisticated understanding of its geology, ecology, and human history, understanding that added detail to frameworks already established through generations of research. The believers who maintained faith in sunken continents continued their own pursuits, finding meaning and community through alternative frameworks that served needs mainstream scholarship did not address. The lost continent of Mu, which had never risen above the Pacific waves, which had never been home to temples or priests or advanced civilization, would continue its peculiar existence in human imagination, a testament to the creative capacities of minds that could build entire worlds from fragments of misunderstood texts and dreams of ancient glory. The legacy of Augustus Le Plongeon, who first decoded what he believed were references to a sunken land in Mayan inscriptions, persisted not in scholarly recognition but in the alternative tradition he had unwittingly initiated. The legacy of James Churchward, who constructed the elaborate mythology of Mu from sources he may have invented, persisted in the books still available in libraries and online, books still discovered by readers seeking alternatives to mainstream history. The legacy of the geologists, archaeologists, linguists, and geneticists who had painstakingly reconstructed the actual history of the Pacific persisted in textbooks, research articles, and museum exhibits that told the genuine story of human achievement in the world's largest ocean. The Pacific itself held no legacy of any lost continent, only the evidence of islands that had risen and sunk according to geological processes indifferent to human imagination. Islands that had been found and settled by voyagers whose real achievements surpassed anything attributed to fictional civilizations. The story of Mu had been, from beginning to end, a story about human minds rather than human history, about the capacity for belief rather than the events of the past, about the needs that lead some people to imagine lost worlds while others patiently reconstruct what actually happened. The sunken continent that never existed would continue not existing, while the real Pacific would continue revealing, to those patient enough to look, wonders that required no fiction to appreciate and no lost civilization to explain.